Marek Vasco did not knock. He never did. He walked into the gala's private corridor like he owned every inch of marble beneath his feet, his two men flanking him, and he stopped directly in front of Sienna Marlowe with a smile that had no warmth anywhere in it. "You're the one he can't stop watching," Marek said softly, tilting his head. "I've seen powerful men fall before, but I've never seen Dante Valeri forget to blink." Sienna held perfectly still. Her champagne glass didn't move. Her expression didn't crack. Marek leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the cold of the winter night still clinging to his coat. "Enjoy tonight," he whispered. "People who matter to Dante Valeri have a very short shelf life." He walked away before anyone could witness it. The orchestra played on. The chandeliers blazed overhead. And somewhere across that glittering ballroom, the most feared man in New York City was watching his capo's hand rest at Sienna's waist, and feeling something crack open inside his chest that 9 years of iron discipline had never once touched. If you've ever loved something so much you became your own worst enemy, you already know how this ends. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you up at night in the best way possible, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Sienna Marlowe accepted the job with Dante Valeri, her mother called it the worst decision of her life. Her mother was not wrong about many things. She was wrong about this. Sienna had spent 11 years working for powerful men in the city, hedge fund managers who mistook cruelty for intelligence, tech founders who confused wealth with wisdom, a state senator whose entire public image she had quietly rebuilt after a scandal that had no business being survivable. She was good at her work in the way that certain people are good at things that exhaust everyone else. She could hold 5 problems in her head simultaneously, read a room before she'd finished stepping into it, and identify the exact moment a negotiation began to tilt, sometimes before the people negotiating had figured it out themselves. She was not impressed by powerful men. She had been around too many of them. But Dante Valeri was not quite like the others, and she'd understood that within the first 10 minutes of their interview. He hadn't tried to overwhelm her. He hadn't listed his assets or his connections or the names of other people he could call instead. He had simply asked her 3 questions, listened to her answers with a quality of attention she wasn't used to receiving from anyone, and then told her the salary and the conditions. "I don't explain myself twice," he'd said. "Not as a threat, just a fact, stated the way someone states the temperature outside." "Neither do I," she'd said. He'd looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way people don't bother doing when they've already decided. And something in his expression had shifted, not softened, shifted. "Good," he'd said. "Start Monday." She'd started Monday. That was 9 months ago. 9 months, and she still hadn't fully mapped the borders of Dante Valeri. He was 51 years old and looked somewhere between 45 and ageless, depending on the light and how much he was concealing. He had the kind of physical presence that didn't require a room to go quiet when he entered. The room went quiet anyway, instinctively, the way animals go still before weather changes. He ran a legitimate shipping empire that moved goods through the port of New York with a precision and reliability that his competitors had spent 2 decades trying and failing to replicate. He also ran, parallel to that, the Valeri organization, the network of arrangements and understandings and enforceable agreements that had made his family the dominant power in the city's underworld since his father's time. Sienna knew about the second operation. She had known before she accepted the job. She was not naive, and she was not idealistic enough to pretend that a man who controlled half the port didn't have a complicated relationship with how certain cargo moved through it. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how much of her actual work would require navigating both worlds simultaneously. The shipping contracts required her to be precise, relentless, and faster than the lawyers on the other side. The family matters. The allies who called at unusual hours. The meetings that happened in rooms without windows. The communication she was asked to monitor for tone and subtext. And the specific kind of hesitation that meant someone was about to betray a trust required an entirely different set of instincts. The ability to read between lines. The patience to wait for information to arrange itself into a shape before drawing conclusions. She was good at that too. What she was less good at, what she had never quite mastered, in 11 years of working for powerful men, was the ability to remain entirely indifferent to them. She didn't have feelings for Dante Valeri. She was clear about that, at least in the moments when she was being honest with herself, which she tried to make as frequent as possible. What she had was something harder to name, a heightened awareness of him, an involuntary habit of tracking where he was in a room, what he was thinking, what was underneath the very controlled surface he presented to everyone around him. She noticed things about him that she suspected no one else noticed, that he never ate the food at meetings, not because he wasn't hungry, but because he was watching too carefully to let himself be distracted, that he kept a photograph in the top drawer of his desk, face down, and had never once mentioned who was in it, that he said "I understand" when he meant "I disagree," and "we'll see" when he meant no, and that the only time he said exactly what he meant was when he was very, very angry. She noticed that he watched her work sometimes, in the way that people watch something that's running efficiently, almost the way you'd watch a machine, not coldly, but with a particular quality of attention, like he was cataloging something. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She was largely successful at believing it. 9 months in, she had stopped trying to pretend she understood every dimension of what she felt in his presence and had simply decided to do her job better than anyone else could and let the rest of it exist without a label. Then the gala came, and everything that had been existing without a label suddenly acquired one. The Valeri family's annual winter gala was not, technically, a family event. It was a legitimate business gathering, a formal celebration of the shipping company's calendar year, attended by the sort of people whose names appeared on the boards of banks and port authorities and municipal infrastructure projects. Dante used it for exactly what it appeared to be, and also for what it quietly was. A room where alliances were reinforced, tensions were assessed, and certain understandings were renewed under the cover of champagne and live orchestra music. Sienna had organized it, every detail, the venue, the guest list, the seating arrangements that required careful thought about which old grievances might flare up in proximity, the catering, the string quartet she'd upgraded to a full orchestra because Dante had mentioned once, briefly, that his wife had loved waltzes. She'd almost not remembered that detail. She was glad she had. She hadn't planned on attending. It wasn't her event in that sense. She was staff, not guest, and she'd spent the previous 2 weeks managing logistics rather than selecting a dress. But Dante had told her 3 days before that she would be there. "In what capacity?" she'd asked. "In the capacity of someone I need in the room." She hadn't pushed for more than that. She'd understood on a practical level that he wanted her present to monitor the dynamics of the room. She was better at reading people than most of his men, and he knew it. What she hadn't been prepared for was the dress. It had arrived at her apartment without explanation. A midnight blue gown, floor-length silk in a weight that draped rather than clung, exactly her size, with a card that said only for the gala and handwriting she didn't recognize. She'd spent longer than she wanted to admit trying to figure out who had sent it. The fit was too precise to be a guess. Someone had paid close attention, and the card told her nothing. She'd worn it anyway. She didn't have something better, and she wasn't going to let the mystery of it make her late. She arrived at the venue 40 minutes before the official start. She'd wanted to do a final walkthrough of the room, check the placement of the security staff, make sure the arrangements for the alderman with the peanut allergy hadn't been overlooked. By the time the guests began arriving, she'd already identified the 3 conversations she needed to track and positioned herself to be within earshot of 2 of them. She hadn't been looking for Dante when she saw him. He was standing near the entrance, in conversation with 2 men from the Harbor Authority, and he was doing the thing he did at these events where his body language communicated patient attention while his eyes very methodically surveyed everything in the room. She'd seen him do it 100 times. She knew exactly what it looked like. What she wasn't prepared for was the way it stopped. He stopped doing it. For 1 full second, the careful surveillance just ceased. His eyes landed on her and didn't move. It lasted only a moment. He recovered before anyone else could have noticed. But Sienna noticed because she noticed everything about him, and because her heart did something complicated and inconvenient in response that she immediately decided not to examine. She looked away first. She picked up a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking and turned her attention to the room. The gala had been in motion for about 90 minutes when the trouble started. It wasn't dramatic trouble, not yet. It was the kind of trouble that looks like a conversation from a distance. Sienna spotted it because she'd been watching the room with the specific attention Dante had trained her to maintain, and because she recognized one of the men involved, Goretti, a shipping broker who was friendly with the Valeri organization in public and had been quietly feeding information to Marek Vasco's people for 6 months. She knew this because she'd found the pattern in his communication logs 3 weeks ago and had put it in a report that Dante had read twice. She was moving toward a better vantage point to observe the exchange when she found herself trapped. Miss Marlowe. The voice belonged to Cristiano Betti, one of the senior figures from the Harbor Commission, an old man with a pleasant face and deeply unpleasant habits, who had decided some months ago that Sienna's proximity to Dante Valeri made her a useful person to cultivate. He had a way of cornering her at events and talking for far too long about things she had no interest in discussing, and he was doing it now, positioning himself in front of her with the ease of someone who didn't worry about being interrupted. She was stuck. She couldn't walk away from Betty without creating a social incident that would get back to Dante, and she couldn't get to Goretti's conversation, and she was calculating how long she had before the window closed when a hand appeared gently at Betty's shoulder. "Cristiano, I've been looking for you. Alderman Parks needs a word before dinner." The voice was warm and effortless, the voice of a man who had spent his life making other people feel like they were the ones doing him a favor. Roman Calvero was Dante's capo and oldest friend, 3 years older than Dante, with a face that had always been easier to look at than a capo's face had any right to be, and a natural charm that he deployed so smoothly, it took a moment to realize it was also a weapon. Betty excused himself with visible pleasure. Men like Betty always responded well to Roman. Roman watched him go, and then turned to Sienna with an expression that was half apology and half amusement. "Sorry," he said. "I've been watching Betty corner you for the past 10 minutes. I thought you might want a rescue." "I had a plan," Sienna said. "I'm sure you did. Was it better than mine?" She almost smiled, marginally. Roman tilted his head, and there was something genuinely warm in the way he looked at her. The warmth of someone who had assessed a person accurately and approved of what he found, without any of the complications that kind of assessment usually carried. Roman had been unfailingly decent to her since her first week. She hadn't been certain, at first, whether it was genuine or tactical. She had concluded, eventually, that it was both, which in her experience was the most reliable combination. The orchestra had shifted into a waltz. Around them, couples were moving toward the dance floor with the slightly self-conscious ease of people who had been waiting for the music to change. "Dance with me," Roman said. Not a command. Not quite a request. Somewhere in between, the way old-fashioned men sometimes spoke, the phrasing that assumed yes was the natural answer without demanding it. Sienna considered the Goretti situation. She'd lost the window anyway. She considered the long, calculating evening and the dress that was someone's idea of who she was, and the complicated thing her heart had done when Dante stopped surveying the room. "One dance," she said. Roman was a good dancer, which she hadn't expected. He led without overcorrecting, which was rarer than it should have been. They moved through the first turn of the waltz with the ease of two people who were both paying attention, and she had almost settled into something approaching enjoyment when she felt it. Not a sound. Not a word. Just a change in the quality of the air. The specific change that happened in rooms when Dante Valeri became displeased. She knew the sensation. She'd been in enough difficult meetings to recognize the shift in pressure. She turned her head, instinctively, and found him across the ballroom. He was standing completely still. He had the expression he wore when he was holding something that required all of his strength to hold. His eyes were on Roman's hand at her waist, and what was in his face was not the cold authority she was used to. It was something older and raw, and much harder to look at directly. She had never seen Dante Valeri look like that before. She had seen him in negotiations where other people's livelihoods were on the table. She had seen him deliver news that she knew cost him something to deliver without any visible cost at all. She had seen him look at men who had betrayed his trust with an expression so controlled it was almost more frightening than anger. She had never seen him look the way he looked right now. Roman noticed. Of course he noticed. Roman noticed everything. It was one of the things that made him dangerous and useful in equal measure. His step didn't falter, but she felt the slight change in the quality of his attention. "Don't turn around," he said quietly, voice under the music. "I already did." "Then you already know." She looked back at Roman's face. It was careful now, the warmth still present, but the calculation more visible beneath it. "Does he know?" she asked. That he's looking at us like that? Dante always knows what he's doing, Roman said. Whether he knows why is a different question entirely. The waltz was still playing. They were still moving. And across the ballroom, the most controlled man she had ever met was standing completely still, and the storm behind his face was becoming harder to contain with every passing measure of the music. The song had 3 more minutes left. Sienna was fairly certain none of them would last that long. She was right. The waltz still had 2 minutes remaining when she saw Dante begin to move. Not urgently, not visibly, the way a man moves when he has decided something and is not interested in appearing to have decided it. He set down his glass with a precision that was its own kind of signal. His expression had shifted back into the controlled blankness that she'd come to understand was not absence of feeling, but the complete suppression of it. He was crossing the ballroom, toward them. Roman's hand at her waist did not move, but she could feel him making the same calculation she was making. "He's going to do something inadvisable," she said quietly. "He's going to do something he's been working toward for 9 months," Roman said, just as quietly. "Those are sometimes the same thing." Dante reached them in the space between one measure and the next. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone. He looked at Roman with the specific quality of attention that Roman had been on the receiving end of for 20 years, and he said, very quietly, "Give us a moment." It was not a request. Roman released her waist. He stepped back with the ease of a man who is performing ease rather than feeling it, and he offered Sienna a small nod that managed to communicate both apology and something like encouragement, and then he moved away through the crowd with a naturalness that suggested this had been his own idea. And Sienna was standing alone with Dante Valeri in the middle of a dance floor under 300 people's carefully averted attention, and the controlled blankness of his expression was beginning to develop fractures. "Walk with me," he said. "Am I being escorted out of my own event?" Something moved across his face. Not quite what she expected. Not the cold authority, not the strategic calculation, something that looked briefly like the thing he'd been holding, finally putting weight on the joints of the container. "Outside," he said. "Please." She had never heard Dante Valeri say please before. Not to her. Not to anyone in the year she'd worked for him. She walked with him. The terrace off the east side of the ballroom was cold, in the way that late December is cold when you've been standing in a warm room. The kind of cold that reasserts everything. The city spread out below them, doing what cities do, moving, burning light, refusing to stop. Dante stood at the railing and looked at it for a moment. She stood a careful distance away and waited, because she had learned that the most useful thing she could do when he needed to speak was give him room to get there. "That was Roman," he said finally, not an accusation, almost like he was informing himself. "It was a waltz," she said, "at a party I organized, in a dress that arrived at my apartment 3 days ago without a name on the card." The silence stretched. "You sent it," she said. He didn't deny it. She looked at him, at the fractures in the controlled surface, at the jaw that was set too deliberately, the hands on the railing that were holding something other than the railing. "Dante." She said his name like a question, like an equation she'd been given all the variables for and had been asked not to solve. "I know what it looked like," he said. "What did it look like?" He turned to face her then, and she was not prepared for what was in his face when he stopped holding all of it back. Not entirely. Not the way it would have needed to be held back for him to look the way he usually looked. It was still mostly controlled, but in the margins, in the space where control gets expensive and eventually costs too much to maintain, there was something that stopped her breath for a moment. "Like I was losing something," he said, "that I never admitted I had." The cold pressed in around them. Below, the city moved. Sienna stood very still. 9 months. 9 months of watching him not look at her. 9 months of the careful distance that she'd told herself was professional and appropriate, and nothing she needed to name or examine. 9 months of the photograph face down in the drawer, and the meetings she wasn't supposed to understand but did, and the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of work to look at her with the specific quality of attention she didn't know how to categorize. 9 months to get to a terrace in December, where the most feared man in New York City was standing with his hands on a railing and telling her that watching a waltz had cracked open something he'd spent years building walls around. She thought about saying something practical, something that acknowledged the complexity of what they were and what their positions were and what the sensible thing would be in a situation that had no clean edges. Instead, she said, "You sent me a dress." "Yes." "And you picked midnight blue because," he said, and stopped. And then, after a moment, quieter, "I know what looks right for you. I've been trying not to." The chandeliers behind the glass threw light across the terrace in patterns. Somewhere inside, the orchestra was playing something slower. Sienna looked at this man, this complicated, controlled, cracked-open man, and felt the 9 months of unnamed things settle into something she could finally read clearly. This was not going to be simple. Nothing about Dante Valeri was simple, and everything that was about to happen between them was going to be complicated in ways she couldn't fully anticipate yet. But she had never run from complicated. Complicated was what she was made for. "We should go back inside," she said. "The Goretti situation. I know about Goretti." "Then you know it's developing, and standing out here is Sienna." She stopped. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her across the ballroom when Roman's hand was at her waist. And the jealousy, because that was what it was, she could name it now, she could see it clearly, was still there. But underneath it was something else. Something that had been there for 9 months, dressed as professionalism and discipline and careful distance. "We'll deal with Goretti," he said, "but I need you to know that tonight I made a fool of myself in front of 300 people over a waltz, and I'm not entirely sorry." For the first time all evening, Sienna didn't have a strategic response ready. She looked at him, and she said nothing, and she let the December cold hold the space between them, the space that was no longer quite as empty as it had been an hour ago. Inside, unnoticed by either of them, a man in a gray jacket raised his phone and took a photograph. The frame caught Dante's face, the intensity of what was in it, Sienna's stillness, the particular geometry of 2 people standing at a railing in the cold, one of them saying something real for the first time in years. The photograph was encrypted and sent before the waltz inside finished playing. By the time Sienna and Dante returned to the ballroom, 6 feet between them, composure reassembled, professional distance visibly restored, the image was already on its way to Marek Vasco. And Marek, who had spent 3 years looking for Dante Valeri's weakness, looked at the photograph and smiled for the first time in months. He finally had what he needed. The photograph reached Marek Vasco at 11:47 in the evening, while he was sitting in the back room of a restaurant in the meatpacking district that officially did not belong to him, and unofficially was the place where most of his important decisions got made. He looked at it for a long time. Not because he needed to study it. He understood it immediately, the way you understand certain things the moment they arrive, the way a key fits a lock you've been holding for years without knowing it. He looked at it because he wanted to feel it fully before he acted on it. Marek was deliberate that way. It was one of the qualities that had kept him alive and advancing in a business that had a historical tendency to eliminate people who were not deliberate. The photograph showed Dante Valeri on a terrace. It showed the woman beside him, and it showed something in Dante's face that Marek had never, in 12 years of conflict and negotiation and careful surveillance, managed to capture: vulnerability. Marek set the phone face down on the table. He picked up his glass. He drank slowly, and he began to think. By midnight, he had a plan. Sienna did not sleep well. She had returned to her apartment at 12:30, removed the midnight blue dress with more care than she intended to give it, and sat on the edge of her bed in the particular kind of alert exhaustion that comes from a night where too much happened that can't be unprocessed. She made tea, she didn't drink. She looked at her phone twice and put it back down. She was not naive about what the evening had opened. She had spent 11 years working for powerful men, and she had learned, through a combination of observation and occasional painful error, that the moment a professional relationship developed a fault line, everything that had been stable on either side of it became subject to different pressures. She liked the stability of what she had with Dante. She was better at her work than she had ever been anywhere else, not because the work was easy, but because his expectations were real. He actually needed what she provided, and she knew it, and there was a particular satisfaction in being genuinely necessary that she hadn't found in 11 years of working for men who mostly needed mirrors with good listening skills. She did not want to lose that. She also could not stop thinking about what his face had looked like on the terrace, the fractures in it, the thing he'd said, like I was losing something I never admitted I had. She was still thinking about it when her phone lit up at 6:14 in the morning. Not Dante. Roman. We need to talk before you go in. Not at the office. Carmela's, 8 o'clock. She looked at the message for a moment. Roman did not send texts like this. Roman communicated through the office channels, through Dante's scheduling system, through the structured formalities that kept the organization's various operations from bleeding into each other in ways that created complications. A private text to her personal phone before business hours, asking her to meet at a coffee shop that was not associated with Valeri business in any way, meant that Roman had something to say that he did not want going through any channel Dante could monitor. She typed back, "I'll be there." Carmela's was a place on the edge of the neighborhood that had been there long enough to have developed the particular immunity of establishments that have outlasted every trend around them. The coffee was strong and bad, and exactly what it had always been, and no one who worked there was young enough to be curious about the people who came in for quiet conversations. Roman was already there when she arrived, sitting in the corner booth with his coat still on and a cup in front of him that he hadn't touched. He looked like he hadn't slept either, which was unusual. Roman was one of those people who appeared effortlessly composed as a matter of basic personal policy. Sienna sat down across from him. He looked at her. Not the warm assessment she was used to, something more careful. "Last night," he said. "Last night," she agreed. "He pulled me off a floor in the middle of a waltz in front of 40 people who mattered." He said it without heat, just factually, like he was reading from a report. "I've known Dante for 26 years. I've watched him take a phone call mid-surgery. Not his surgery, he doesn't get hurt, he was visiting someone. And I watched him take that call and manage a crisis and come back and finish the conversation he'd started before the phone rang. I have never seen him do something impulsive." "He said please," Sienna said. Roman blinked. "When he asked me to go outside with him, he said please." Roman sat back. He rubbed his hand across his face briefly, the way men do when they're recalibrating. Yes, that tracks, actually." "Roman, why are we here?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and set his phone on the table, turned to face her, with an image on the screen. The photograph. Her and Dante on the terrace, the city behind them and the light from the chandeliers cutting across his face. She kept her expression neutral. "Where did that come from?" "One of my people flagged it this morning. It was taken last night, sometime after 11. Encrypted, transmitted off-site within about 3 minutes of being captured." He paused. "It's already in Marek Vasco's hands." The coffee shop noise continued around them. Cups, low conversations, the sound of a city starting its morning. And none of it touched the specific silence that settled over the booth. "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure." He picked the phone back up. "The transmission route is one we've been tracking for 2 months. It's how Marek gets information out of rooms he's not in. We've been trying to identify the source." He stopped. "We still don't know who took it." Sienna looked at the photograph again. At her own face in it, composed, careful, the face she maintained in professional situations. And at Dante's face, which was none of those things. "He needs to know," she said. "He already knows." She looked up. "I sent it to him at 6 this morning," Roman said. "I'm telling you separately because—" He stopped. "Chose something different. Because last night complicated the information structure. Before last night, you were his assistant and the information went to him and filtered to you as relevant. After last night, I think you're entitled to know things directly." She studied him. Roman was doing several things at once, and she could feel the layers of it. He was being genuinely decent, which he usually was. I was also assessing her, assessing what last night had made of her, in the structural sense, in terms of where she fit in the organization's information hierarchy going forward. And underneath both of those things, she could feel something else, something she hadn't expected. "You're worried about him," she said, "not about the photograph, about what it means that it got taken in the first place." Roman's expression didn't change, but something in it confirmed what she'd said. "Dante doesn't make mistakes in public," he said quietly. "In 26 years, I've seen him make exactly 2 decisions that exposed him in ways he didn't control. The first one was when he married Elena." He paused. The name sat in the air between them. "The second one was last night." "Elena." The photograph face down in the desk drawer. Sienna had read the file. Not the personal parts. Those didn't exist in any file. but the structural facts. Dante's wife, dead 6 years ago. A car accident that was not an accident. An enemy who had learned through patient observation exactly where Dante was most exposed, and had moved against that exposure with the specific coldness of someone who understood that the fastest way to destabilize a powerful man is not to threaten him, but to take something that cannot be replaced. The car had gone into the East River on a Tuesday morning in November. Dante had found out during a board meeting. He had finished the meeting. She had always found that detail almost unbearable to think about, not because it was monstrous, but because she could imagine exactly what it had cost him. The controlled surface, holding everything. The board meeting, finished. Whatever was underneath it, held until later, held until private, held until somewhere that wasn't a room full of people who would use it against him. She understood now why he had built the distance, why he had spent 6 years making himself into something that did not have soft points. She understood it the way you understand things that are both completely rational and also an enormous tragedy. Mark isn't going to move immediately, she said, because she needed to think out loud, and Roman was the right person to think out loud with. He'll want to confirm the intelligence first, assess whether what he saw in that photograph is what he thinks it is. That's my read too, Roman said, which gives us some time, not much. Does Dante know I know? He will in approximately, Roman glanced at his watch, 40 minutes when you walk into the office. She nodded slowly. Okay. Sienna. Roman waited until she looked at him. What happened on the terrace is going to make the next several weeks significantly more complicated. You understand that? I understand that. And you're... He stopped again. He was choosing his words with a care that was unlike him, and she appreciated it even as she found it slightly painful to watch. You're going to be a target, whether or not what happened last night develops into something. The photograph exists. Marek has it. The conclusion he's drawn from it is the conclusion he was going to draw, regardless of what you and Dante actually are to each other. I know. I want to make sure you actually know, not intellectually, that you understand what it means in a practical sense, that Marek Vasco now considers you a point of leverage, she finished. The words sat there, flat and accurate and completely without comfort. Roman nodded. She picked up her coffee. It was bad, and she drank it anyway because it was hot, and she needed something to do with her hands. Thank you, she said, for telling me separately. Don't thank me. He said it without harshness, just simply. Go talk to Dante. Dante was in his office when she arrived. That was not unusual. He was almost always there before anyone else. What was unusual was that he was standing at the window instead of at his desk, which meant he was somewhere inside himself that he didn't want documented by the posture of a man doing work. She closed the door behind her. He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his face had the morning-controlled quality it always had, but there were lines under his eyes that suggested the night had not been generous. Roman told you, he said. Roman told me. He looked at her steadily. And you already knew last night was a risk, she said. You knew when you walked across that ballroom. Something moved across his face. I did. So why did you do it anyway? The question sat in the room. She hadn't softened it and didn't intend to. She needed to understand this because understanding it was the difference between being able to work with him effectively in the next several weeks and being unable to trust her own read of him. Dante moved away from the window. He sat down, not at his desk, in the chair across from it, which she noticed because he never sat there. That was the chair for other people. He sat in it like someone who had decided to make himself smaller on purpose. Because, he said, and stopped. Then, measuring something. I spent 6 years being very careful, and I spent 9 months being very careful about you specifically, and I watched Roman put his hand at your waist, and all of that careful just stopped working. That's jealousy, she said. Dante, you know that's... I know what it is, he said. Not sharply, quiet, the way someone says something they've been sitting with all night. I know exactly what it is. I also know that 9 months ago I would have told you. Jealousy was a failure of discipline, and I wouldn't have been wrong. He paused. I'm still not wrong. It's still a failure of discipline. It just turns out that 9 months of something changes what you're capable of controlling. She looked at him. At the tiredness that was visible this morning in ways it usually wasn't. at the particular quality of a man who has been honest with himself in the small hours of the night and is still holding the results. "You know what Marek is going to do with that photograph?" she said. "Yes." "And you know what that means for my position here?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "I have been thinking about little else since 6 this morning." "And your answer is what?" He looked up at her, and the thing that was in his face when he did, the specific combination of exhaustion and something that was not quite defeat but was adjacent to it, made her chest do the complicated thing again. "My answer," he said carefully, "is that I should have been more careful last night, and that I cannot undo what I wasn't careful about, and that the options in front of me now are either pretend the photograph shows nothing, which Marek won't believe, or—" He stopped. "Or what?" "Or bring you in," he said, "fully. Not as the person who organizes my calendar and monitors my communications, as someone who has the full picture. All of it." He paused. "Because the situation we're walking into with Marek is not manageable without the best strategic mind in this office, and I'm looking at her, and she deserves to know what she's walking into." The room was quiet. Outside, the city was doing its mourning. Sienna looked at this man who had built walls for 6 years and cracked one of them last night in front of 300 people over a waltz, and who was now sitting in the chair that was not his chair and offering her something that she understood was genuinely difficult for him. Not the information, but the admission that he needed her to have it. That he needed her, period, in a way that went beyond what an employer needed a capable assistant. "Full picture," she said. "Full picture. That's a significant offer. It's a significant situation." He held her gaze. "You're already in it. The photograph put you in it regardless of what you chose. I'd rather you be in it with everything you need." She crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from him. Her usual chair, the one where she'd spent 9 months managing his calendar and monitoring his communications and being, as she was now understanding, far more deeply embedded in the machinery of his life than either of them had wanted to acknowledge. "Tell me about Marek," she said. "Everything. Not the version you've been filtering for operational relevance. Everything." And Dante looked at her, and after a moment he began to talk. It took 2 hours. She had known the shape of it, the port operations, the ledger that Marek had spent 18 months trying to locate, the network of corrupt municipal officials whose names were on Marek's payroll, and also, she was now learning, on a digital file that Dante had been carefully assembling for 4 years. She had not known the depth of it, the specific officials, the specific leverage points, the fact that the ledger was not just evidence of wrongdoing, but a functional weapon capable of dismantling half the city's underground infrastructure if released in the right sequence to the right federal contacts. She also had not known about the man inside Dante's own organization. "You have a leak," she said when he finished. "I have a suspected leak." He was careful about the distinction. "I don't know where. I know that 3 pieces of information that should not have reached Marek did reach him over the past 4 months, and those 3 pieces could only have come from someone with access to internal meetings." "What meetings?" He listed them. She filed them, cross-referencing against her own knowledge of who had been present, who had been excluded, what the access overlaps were. "What's your working assumption?" she asked. "One person, someone senior enough to have access to all 3. Someone who has been in place long enough that I haven't questioned them." He paused. "Someone who knew, last night, where I was going to be and when." The implication settled over the room. The photograph had come from inside the gala, from someone who had been invited, who had been trusted to be there, who had known which terrace to watch and when to point a camera at it. "Roman?" she asked, because she had to ask it, even though she already knew the answer. "No." Dante said it without hesitation, without the slight beat that might suggest he'd considered it. "Not Roman." "I had to ask." "I know." He looked at her. "Roman has had 26 opportunities to take something from me that would have made him very comfortable for the rest of his life. He's never taken any of them." He paused. "He came to me 6 years ago, after Elena, and he stayed, when it would have been significantly easier and safer for him to—" He stopped, recalibrated. "Not Roman." She accepted that. "Then we have a problem." "We have several." "In order of urgency?" He almost smiled, not quite, but almost. "That's why I need you in the room," he said. She pulled out her notebook, actual paper, which she used because she thought better when she wrote by hand and because paper left no digital footprint. And she began. They were still working at noon when Roman knocked and came in without waiting, which was one of the approximately 3 behaviors that Roman was permitted to perform without an invitation. And he came in with his phone in his hand and an expression on his face that told her, before he spoke, that the morning's calculations had already been overtaken by events. "Marek moved," Roman said. Dante looked up. "Where?" "The warehouse on Barker Street. The shipment we were moving today. The one with the secondary documents." Sienna was already standing. "The secondary documents that include the preliminary ledger files, yes." Roman's voice was flat and precise, the voice he used when he was angry and controlling it. "Someone told him when it was moving and where it was going. The convoy was intercepted 40 minutes ago." He looked at Dante. "They didn't get the documents. Our people got them out, but 2 of our men are in the hospital, and the convoy driver." He stopped. The room held that stop. "How bad?" Dante asked. "He'll live," Roman said. "Probably." Dante stood. In the movement, she could see the controlled fury assembling itself, the strategic anger that was different from the raw thing she'd seen on the terrace last night. This was the version that had teeth and direction, the version that had made him what he was. "Who knew about the convoy?" he said. 7 people, Roman said, "including the 3 of us." Dante looked at him, then at her, then back at Roman. 4 people, he said. "Find the 4th person." "Dante." She said it before she made the decision to say it. He turned. The fury was fully assembled behind his eyes, and she knew, with the certainty she had developed over 9 months of reading this man, that if she didn't say the next thing correctly, the next several hours were going to be very bad for a large number of people, and possibly also for the long-term goal of anyone surviving the situation intact. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You're thinking about last night. You're thinking the photograph was the opening move and this was the second, and you're calculating how to make sure there isn't a third." He didn't say anything. "And the calculation you're doing right now is not a strategic calculation," she said. "It's an emotional one. You're frightened. Not for yourself, you don't frighten easily for yourself. And when you're frightened for something else, you reach for control, and right now the form of control that feels available is overwhelming force." Roman was very still in the doorway. Dante was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode, and that was unusual, because she could usually decode him. "Marek wants you to react," she said. "He took the photograph specifically to provoke a reaction. The convoy was his follow-up, his proof that the provocation worked. If you move against him right now with force, you're giving him exactly the confirmation he needs that the woman in that photograph is the way to destroy you." She paused. "And you will also be destroying the only structural advantage you have, which is that he doesn't know what we know yet." The silence stretched. "What do we know?" Roman asked, carefully, looking between them. "That his real objective isn't the preliminary files," Sienna said. She was looking at Dante, watching his face process what she'd said the previous night, and what she'd learned this morning, and what she was now putting together. "The convoy was a test. He wanted to see if we'd move the main ledger in response to the attack. He wanted to panic us into relocating it." She turned to Roman. "Where's the main ledger right now?" Roman looked at Dante. Dante looked at her. "Tell her," he said. Roman told her. She thought for a moment. Then, "We need to move it before tonight. Not where he'd expect. And we need to do it in a way that looks like panic, so he thinks it worked." She looked at Dante. "Can you hold for 24 hours? Not retaliate. Not move overtly. Just hold." The fury behind his eyes had not gone away. But something else was moving through it. The part of him that was genuinely exceptional at what he did. The part that had kept the Valeri organization functioning through threats that would have dismantled other men, hearing what she was telling him, and beginning very carefully to agree with it. 24 hours, he said. 24 hours, she confirmed. Roman exhaled. She wasn't sure he'd been breathing. Dante walked to his desk. He sat down in his own chair, finally, and put his hands flat on the surface of it, and looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man counting the cost of something and paying it anyway. "The 4th person," he said. "I want a name before tonight." "You'll have one," she said. She didn't know yet if that was true, but she was going to make it true, because the alternative was a man she was beginning to understand she cared about making a decision out of fear that would cost him everything he'd built. And she had not spent 9 months of her professional life inside this complicated, controlled, cracked-open situation to watch it come apart because Marek Vasco knew which terrace to point a camera at. She picked up her notebook. She began to work. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she had narrowed the list of the fourth person to 2 names. By 5:30, she had 1. She looked at the name on her notebook page for a long moment. She thought about what it meant, not abstractly but concretely, in terms of what it was going to do to Dante when she walked back into his office and said it out loud. Because she had been right in her earlier assessment that Dante was frightened. Frightened for her, frightened of what his own exposure on that terrace had set in motion. And fear in a man like this had a particular and dangerous quality, the quality of something that had been contained for 6 years suddenly having a direction to move in. She thought about Elena, the photograph face down in the drawer, the Tuesday morning in November. She thought about what Dante had said the previous night, on the terrace, with the city spread out below them and the chandeliers throwing their light through the glass, like I was losing something I never admitted I had. She stood up. She walked down the hall. She opened the door. Dante looked up from his desk, and she could see from the set of his face that he had spent the past several hours in the particular productive silence that meant he'd been doing his own work, running his own calculations, drawing his own conclusions. She could also see, in the specific quality of his stillness when she came in, that he had been waiting for her to come back. She sat down in her chair. She looked at him. "Carlo Mensetti," she said. The name landed in the room. She watched it land in Dante's face, watched the recognition, the calculation, the particular and specific pain of a name that was not a stranger. Carlo Mensetti had been with the Valeri organization for 11 years. He had been at the warehouse meeting. He had been at 2 of the 3 other compromised meetings. And he had been, she had discovered through 3 hours of careful cross-referencing of communication logs and access records, and one very telling discrepancy in a transport manifest from 8 weeks ago, the source of the preliminary ledger location. He had also been at the gala. Dante looked at her for a long moment. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain." He nodded. Once. Slowly. The way a man nods when he receives information that confirms something he had hoped was wrong. He picked up his phone. He called Roman. He said 3 words. A name and 2 syllables that she had heard him say before in other contexts, and that, in the Valeri organization's internal language, meant a very specific thing. And then he ended the call. He set the phone down. He looked at her again, and in his face was the full weight of the evening and the morning and the afternoon. And under it was something that had not been there 6 years ago, or 9 months ago, or even this morning, the look of a man who has understood at considerable cost that the decision to close himself off from what he cared about had not protected anything. It had only given Marek Vasco a longer window to prepare. "Tonight," he said, "I'm going to need you to stay." She looked at him. "Not for safety," he said quickly, as if preempting an objection she hadn't been preparing. "For the planning. What comes next has to be right, and He stopped. He looked briefly, like someone who is holding something heavy and has decided to admit it's heavy. "I can't see all of it without you." Outside, the city was going dark. The lights were coming on in the buildings across from the window, the kind of light that made New York look, from a distance, like something that had never had a shadow. Sienna Marlowe looked at the man across the desk from her. The complicated, controlled, cracked open, exhausted, frightened man who had sent her a midnight blue dress without signing the card and pulled his oldest friend off a dance floor and then sat in the wrong chair in his own office and told her she deserved to know what she was walking into. She thought about what Roman had said that morning in the coffee shop with the bad coffee. People who matter to Dante Valeri have a very short shelf life. She thought about what she'd said to Dante on the terrace, the thing she hadn't planned to say but had said anyway. The thing that had been true before she understood it was, "You sent me a dress." She thought about the name she had just put in the room, the cost of finding it, what came next because of it. She opened her notebook to a clean page. "Then let's get started," she said. And somewhere across the city, Marek Vasco received confirmation that the convoy interception had failed to produce the main ledger, and understood for the first time that Dante Valeri was not going to make this simple. He was also beginning to understand something else, something the photograph had shown him that he hadn't fully processed until now. The woman in that photograph was not a weakness. She was the reason Dante was still thinking clearly, which meant she needed to be removed from the equation, not as leverage, but as a threat. And Marek had already put the next move in motion before Dante and Sienna had finished their first sentence. The clean page of Sienna's notebook did not stay clean for long. By 7 in the evening, it had 4 pages of notes behind it: names, dates, access logs, the specific timing of 3 information leaks mapped against Carlo Mensetti's movement records over the past 4 months. She had drawn lines between things, crossed out 2 early assumptions that hadn't held under scrutiny, and arrived at a structural picture of how Marek's intelligence operation inside the Valeri organization had actually worked. It was not elegant. Most real things weren't. It was patient and opportunistic, and had exploited exactly the kind of blind spot that develops when an organization trusts someone for 11 years without rechecking the foundation of that trust. Dante had listened to all of it without interrupting. That was one of the things she had learned about him in 9 months. He listened with his whole attention, without the restless performance of listening that most powerful men substituted for the real thing. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment, processing. And then he asked 2 questions that she hadn't anticipated and that she had to think about carefully before answering. Roman came back at 8 with confirmation that Carlo Mensetti had been located and secured. He said it the way people in the Valeri organization said things like that, with the specific economy of language that communicated what had happened without detailing the texture of it. "He'll talk tonight," Roman said. "He already talked," Dante said. "That's the problem." Roman looked at the wall of notes Sienna had assembled and said nothing for a moment. Then, "How much does Marek have?" "Enough to know the ledger exists and approximately where it's been kept," Sienna said. "Not enough to know what's in it, and not enough to know about the federal contacts." She paused. "That last part is the most important. If Marek knew about the federal angle, he would have moved differently. He would have moved faster," Dante said. "He would have moved to eliminate the contacts, not the ledger," she said. "He's still treating this as an asset seizure problem. He thinks if he gets the ledger, he controls the narrative." She looked at Dante. "He doesn't understand yet that the narrative is already written. The ledger is just the delivery mechanism." Roman sat down. He looked at her with the expression she was becoming familiar with, the one that meant he was recalibrating his assessment of a situation based on something she'd just said. "You're saying we let him come for the ledger." "I'm saying we make him think he can get it," she said. "Which is different." Dante was looking at her with the particular quality of attention that had no professional distance left in it, the kind of attention that belonged to the terrace, and the midnight blue dress, and the fractures in controlled surfaces. She noticed it and kept her focus on the notebook. 24 hours, he said quietly. "That's what you asked me to hold for." "That's what I'm asking you to hold for." He nodded. "Once. The same weight as before, the same cost." She went home at 10:30. He had offered, not in words, in the specific hesitation before he said goodnight that communicated several things without stating any of them. And she had declined because she needed sleep, and she needed the distance of her own apartment, and she needed, most urgently, to be alone for a few hours with everything that was happening so she could feel the shape of it without managing anyone else's reaction to it at the same time. She slept 4 hours. She was back at the office by 6. The morning of the following day had the specific quality of mornings that are deceptive, cold and clear, the kind of light that makes everything look more manageable than it is. Sienna had 2 cups of coffee and a conversation with Roman that confirmed Carlo Mensetti had provided, under the kind of persuasion that the Valeri organization was equipped to apply, a full account of his arrangement with Marek's people. The account was worse than she'd expected, not in the information Carlo had passed, that she'd already mapped. What was worse was the timeline. Carlo had been Marek's source for not 4 months but 14. He had been in place, feeding small and carefully selected pieces of intelligence, for over a year, long enough and patiently enough that none of the individual pieces had been large enough to trigger suspicion. Marek had been playing a long game that was longer than anyone had calculated. She sat with that for a few minutes, alone in the office she'd been given down the hall from Dante's. She sat with the particular feeling of realizing that a situation she'd thought she understood had deeper roots than she'd seen. It was not panic, exactly, but it was adjacent to panic. The cold recognition that the ground you've been standing on has less under it than you believed. She wrote it down. She looked at what she'd written. She began to revise the timeline. The revision changed several things. It meant that Marek's knowledge of the ledger's general location was older than they'd thought, which meant his patience in not moving on it was a strategic choice rather than a gap in his intelligence. He had known and had waited, and the question she now needed to answer was, waited for what? She was still working on that question when her phone rang. Unknown number. That alone was enough to make her go still. Her personal phone was secure, the number known to approximately 9 people, and unknown numbers did not call it. She answered without speaking. Ms. Marlowe. The voice was even and unhurried, with the specific quality of a man who had arranged this moment carefully and was in no rush to leave it. My name is Marek Vasco. I think it's time we spoke directly. The air in the room changed. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she wasn't usually aware of it. Not racing, just suddenly audible, suddenly present. She did not say anything immediately. She registered. He had her personal number. 14 months of Carlo Mensetti meant 14 months of access to information that should have been inaccessible. Her personal number was one of those things. Mr. Vasco, she said. Her voice came out even. She was quietly grateful for that. I'll be brief, Marek said. I've been watching Dante Valeri for a long time. I've watched him manage threats, absorb losses, outmaneuver people who are very good at what they do. I have a great deal of respect for him, in the way that you respect something that requires a specific tool to open. A pause. You're the tool I've been missing. She said nothing. I don't want to hurt you, he continued in the same unhurried tone. I want to make you an offer, a real one, not a threat dressed as an offer, an actual proposition between two people who are both more intelligent than the situation they've ended up in. I'm listening, she said, because the only thing worse than listening to what Marek Vasco wanted to say was not listening to it. The ledger, he said. I know it exists. I know it names people who would prefer not to be named. I know Dante has been assembling it for 4 years, which I find genuinely impressive. I would like to know where it is. And in exchange? In exchange, you walk away from this cleanly, from the Valeri organization, from the situation that photograph put you in, from the next several weeks, which are going to be... He paused, and she could hear in the pause the quality of someone choosing the right word with genuine care. Difficult for everyone close to Dante. He stopped. I know what happened to Elena Valeri. I know what it cost him. I know you've read the file. You're intelligent enough to have read the file. Another pause. I'm offering you the exit that she didn't get. The room was very quiet. Sienna looked at the wall in front of her, at the notes she'd made the previous evening, and the revised timeline she'd been working on, and the specific question she'd been trying to answer about what Marek had been waiting for. She understood, in this moment, with a clarity that was almost physical, exactly what he'd been waiting for. Her. He'd been waiting for the photograph, for the evidence that Dante had a soft point again, after 6 years of not having one. He'd been waiting because attacking Dante when Dante had nothing to lose was a different equation than attacking Dante when Dante had something specific and recent and visible that he was trying to protect. She had become the variable that changed the equation. I need 24 hours to consider it, she said. A beat. Then, you have 12. The warmth in his voice, which had been performing reasonableness until this moment, acquired an edge. Not a threat precisely, just the removal of the performance. I know the time frame you're working with, Ms. Marlowe. I know what you're planning. I know about the federal contacts. Carlo was thorough. The cold that moved through her was not the December cold from the terrace. It was the cold of something structural giving way. Carlo had known about the federal contacts, which meant Marek knew, which meant everything she'd told Dante last night, the foundational assessment that Marek didn't know about the federal angle, the strategic advantage that rested entirely on that assumption, was wrong. Had been wrong the entire time she was saying it. 12 hours, she said. Ms. Marlowe, he said, almost gently, don't tell Dante about this call. I know you're going to tell him. I'm asking you not to, as a professional courtesy, because if you tell him, his first instinct is going to be to do something that makes the next 12 hours significantly worse for both of you. A pause. I've seen what he does when he's frightened for someone. You have too now. The line disconnected. She sat for 30 seconds without moving. She was aware very precisely of the exact dimensions of the room around her: the desk, the notes, the window, the sound of the building doing its mourning. She was aware of the fact that her hands were completely steady, which surprised her slightly. Then she stood up, walked down the hall, and knocked twice on Dante's door. She told him everything, including the instruction not to tell him, which she stated without editorial comment, and watched his jaw tighten in response. She told him about the federal contacts, about Carlo's knowledge, about the timeline revision, about the specific quality of Marek's voice when the performance of reasonableness had dropped. She told him about the offer. Dante listened to all of it the way he listened to things, with complete attention, without interrupting, with the controlled quality that she now understood was not distance but the opposite of distance, the thing he did when something mattered enough that he couldn't afford to react until he'd heard all of it. When she finished, the silence lasted a long time. Roman was there. He had come in somewhere in the middle of it, arriving at the door with the instinct of a man who had spent 26 years learning to read the specific frequency of bad news. I was standing by the window now, very still. Dante looked at the surface of his desk. He looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things he was seeing through rather than at. Then he said, "He knows about Reyes." Thomas Reyes was the federal contact, the one who had been quietly building the case around the ledger for 2 years, the one whose involvement made the entire operation viable and also made it fragile in the specific way that things become fragile when they depend on one structural element that cannot be replaced. "He knows about Reyes," she confirmed. "Then the ledger isn't the primary target anymore," Dante said, still looking at the desk. "If he moves on Reyes, he won't," she said. "Not yet. Moving on a federal contact triggers a response that Marek can't control. He knows that. He's too careful." She paused. "He'll use the knowledge of Reyes as leverage, to make you move the ledger in a way that exposes it. Or to make you hand it to him," Roman said from the window. His voice was carefully neutral in the way that voices go when they are suppressing something. She looked at him. I was looking at Dante. "She just told you about the offer," Roman said. "She didn't have to. She could have taken 12 hours to think about it, which is what Marek expected her to do." He paused. "I'm not questioning her. I'm pointing out that Marek is." The room absorbed that. Dante looked up from the desk. He looked at her, and in his face was the specific conflict of a man who trusts someone and also understands that the people who manipulate most effectively are the ones you trust. She could see him working through it. Not the jealousy, not the fear, but the cold strategic intelligence that had kept him functioning for 20 years, running its processes on information it hadn't asked to receive. "Leave us," he said to Roman. Roman left without a word. The door closed. She did not look away from Dante. "Say it," she said. "I'm not thinking it," he said. "You're considering it. That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He was very still. "Marek called your personal phone, which means he has access to information that should have been inaccessible to him. He made you an offer that required you to come in here and report it, which is exactly what he told you not to do." He paused. "That's not an offer. That's a test. He's testing whether you're still making decisions based on your own judgment or whether you've reorganized yourself around protecting me." She felt the accuracy of it like something landing. "And?" she said. "And if the answer is the second one," he said quietly, "then he already has you, not through the offer, through the photograph, through what happened on the terrace." He looked at her with something that was not accusation, but was the most painful cousin of it. The look of a man who is looking at something he caused. "Through me." The room was silent for a moment. "Dante," she said. "I told you," he said. His voice had dropped into the register it went to when he was holding something that was costing him considerably. "I told you that night. Distance wasn't indifference. It was this." He looked away, briefly, toward the window. "This exact situation, where someone who came too close to me becomes the thing that can be used against everything I've built." "You're not going to do this," she said. He looked back at her. "You're not going to use Marek's play as a reason to rebuild the distance," she said. "That's exactly what he wants. He wants you isolated and reactive, making decisions from a position of guilt rather than strategy. He sent that offer because he understood it would create this exact conversation." She stopped. Don't give him this room, Dante. The silence stretched. Outside, the city moved in its indifferent morning way, not knowing or caring about the particular weight of the air in this specific office, in this building, between these two people. Dante stood up. He moved to the window where he'd been standing when she'd come in the previous morning, the window that seemed to be where he went when he needed something to look at that wasn't a person. He stood there for a moment. The federal contacts, he said finally. If Marek knows about Reyes, we can assume he knows about the others. The others are less critical, she said. Reyes is the load-bearing element. Can we move the timeline up? The case Reyes has been building. He needs 6 more weeks to make it prosecution ready, she said. I spoke to him last month. If we go to him now with what we have, it's survivable, but not complete. Some of the officials in the ledger would walk. Which officials? She listed them. She watched Dante's face as she did, watched which names landed hardest, understood from his reactions the specific texture of what those names meant in the organization of the port, in the political infrastructure of the city, in the long, complicated history of how Dante Valeri had built something that was also trying to destroy it. Tanner walks, she said, finishing the list. Tanner and De Castro both. Dante turned from the window. Tanner is the reason Elena's accident was never properly investigated. The room held that sentence. She hadn't known that. It wasn't in any files she'd read. She looked at him with the specific attention of someone receiving a piece of information that reorganizes everything around it. 6 years, she said softly. 6 years, he said. The ledger was always about more than the harbor. He looked at her. It started as the harbor. It became about that case, and the fact that the same man who buried it is still sitting on the Port Authority Commission, making decisions about which cargo gets inspected and which doesn't. She understood now why he'd spent 4 years assembling something that most people in his position would have considered unnecessary given the other tools available to them. She understood what it had cost him, the patience of it, the discipline of building something that required 6 weeks more to be complete, and having to wait for those 6 weeks while the situation around him compressed. We need the 6 weeks, she said. We don't have 12 hours before Marek moves on the ledger location. Then we don't let him move on the ledger location. She crossed to the desk. She picked up her notebook. We give him something else to move on. He was watching her. The preliminary files, she said, the ones from the warehouse convoy. They're damaged but recoverable. Not recoverable enough to be useful to Marek, but he doesn't know that. He knows we moved them out of the convoy. He doesn't know their condition. She looked at Dante. We let him believe the preliminary files are the main ledger. We let him believe Carlo missed the real location and gave him the wrong one by accident. Dante was very still. Carlo told him the main ledger was on Barker Street, she said. The convoy was on Barker Street. Marek moved on it and got the preliminary files, which he thinks are incomplete copies. If we let him discover, through a source he trusts more than Carlo, that the preliminary files are actually the main ledger and Carlo was confused about which was which, he stops looking for the real one, Roman said. She turned. Roman had come back in at some point. She hadn't heard the door, but he was there, in his usual place by the window, with his coat still on and his expression doing the careful, neutral thing. He was looking at her notes. For how long? He asked. Long enough, she said. If we feed it right, long enough. Dante looked at Roman. Roman looked at Dante. Something passed between them that had the quality of 26 years of shorthand, the kind of communication that required no words, because the words had all been said before in different rooms with different crises, and the underlying grammar was by now automatic. The source Marek trusts more than Carlo, Dante said. Who are we talking about? She had been thinking about this since the phone call. She had been thinking about it in the specific way she thought about problems that had only one viable solution, even when that solution was a bad one. The way you look at a door you don't want to open and keep looking at it because it's the only door in the room. Me, she said. The word sat in the room. Roman went very still. Dante said nothing. His face went through several things in rapid succession. She could track them, the calculation, the rejection of the calculation, the return of the calculation, and underneath all of it, the thing that was not professional, the thing from the terrace, the thing she'd seen in the fractures of his controlled surface. No, he said. It's the only source he'd believe, she said. He called me directly. He made me an offer. In his current framework, I'm either loyal to you or I'm someone he can turn. If I come back to him with a counteroffer, information about the ledger's apparent location in exchange for the exit he described, he will believe it. He has every reason to believe it. The photograph, the offer, the 12-hour window. He built this scenario specifically to produce this outcome. And if he doesn't believe it? Roman said quietly. She looked at him. Then we're in the same position we're in right now, except we've used 12 hours. If he doesn't believe it, Dante said, and he decides you're feeding him false information, you become a threat instead of an asset. Marek's management of threats is not... He stopped. I know how Marek manages threats, she said. Sienna. I know, she said again, more quietly. She looked at him. I know the risk. I'm not calculating without the risk included. She paused. The question isn't whether there's risk. The question is whether the alternative, doing nothing or moving on the ledger before it's ready, produces a better outcome. Dante looked at her for a long, long moment. She could see everything it cost him to be in this moment. The 6 years of walls and the 9 months of careful distance and the 1 night of fractured control and the morning photograph and the 12-hour clock running and Elena's name in the room and Tanner's name in the ledger and the specific weight of a man who has been trying to protect something from himself for so long that he's forgotten the protection was always a choice. Roman, he said without looking away from her. What's the protocol for extracting an embedded civilian from a Vasco-controlled meat if it goes wrong? Roman began to answer. She felt something shift in the room. The shift of a plan becoming real, of a decision landing after a long fall. She opened her notebook to a new page. Her hand was steady. Outside, the 12 hours were running, and Marek Vasco's phone was already charged and waiting, sitting on a restaurant table in the meatpacking district, for a call he was reasonably confident he would receive before the clock ran out. He was right about that. He was wrong about everything the call would mean. She called him at 2 in the afternoon. She used her personal phone, the same number he'd called, because using anything else would have signaled preparation, and preparation would have broken the performance she needed him to believe. He answered on the second ring. I was starting to think you'd gone to Dante, he said. I did go to Dante, she said. I told him about the call. A pause. Slightly longer than she expected. And, he said. And he told me to think carefully, she said. She kept her voice at the specific register of a woman who is tired and making a decision she's not entirely at peace with, which was not difficult because she was tired and she was making a decision she wasn't entirely at peace with, which I did. What did you decide? I want to meet, she said, in person. Before I tell you anything, I want to see the exit you described, documentation, specifics. I'm not handing you anything for a verbal promise. Another pause. Longer this time. She waited. She was aware of her own breathing. She kept it even. Tonight, Marek said. 10 o'clock. There's a restaurant on Fulton Street called Calder's. Go in alone. I'll be there, she said. She ended the call. She set the phone down. She looked at the wall for a moment. Roman knocked and came in before she could speak. We got a location, he said. She nodded. Dante wants to run the extraction protocols himself, Roman said. His voice was careful. He's not going to be visible, but he's going to be there. She had expected that. She hadn't decided yet whether it made things easier or more complicated. The preliminary files, she said. Are they ready? Our people finished the packaging 20 minutes ago, Roman said. They look complete. They look like the real thing. He paused. They're not. They don't need to be, she said. They just need to look like it for long enough. Roman was watching her with the warm, careful combination she'd come to read as him experiencing something he wasn't sure how to categorize. He said, You know this plan has about 6 moving parts that can each go wrong independently. I know. And you're going anyway. Yes. He looked at her for a moment, then he said something she didn't expect. She would have done this too, he said. Elena, she was a lot of things. But she would have done this. He stopped. I'm not comparing you. I'm saying that the reason Dante is terrified right now is not just the situation. It's that you are the first person in 6 years who has walked into something he couldn't protect her from and said, essentially, let me handle it. The room was quiet. He's not going to like it, she said. He's going to hate it, Roman said. He's going to stand in a cold parking garage at 10 o'clock tonight and hate every single second of it. He looked at her steadily. And he's going to be there. Because that's what he does with things that matter to him now, apparently. He stops pretending they don't. She looked at her notebook. At the plan laid out in her handwriting, with its 6 moving parts, and its false ledger, and its 10 o'clock meeting, and its 12-hour clock that had now become 6. She thought about what Roman had said about Elena, and she thought about the photograph face down in the drawer, and she thought about the waltz, and Roman's hand at her waist, and the look on Dante's face across the ballroom. The look that had started all of it, the fracture that had let Marek see what he needed to see, the moment that had led to this particular Tuesday afternoon in December with a phone call made and a meeting set and a plan that had 6 ways to fail and possibly 1 way to work. She thought about what love without trust looked like. She thought about what trust without love cost. She closed the notebook. 6 hours, she said. Roman nodded. She picked up her coat. And across the city, in the back room of a restaurant that didn't officially belong to him, Marek Vasco was already rearranging the table. He had not told his lieutenants what the 10 o'clock meeting was for. He had not told them about the call, or the offer, or the woman who had agreed to come in alone. He had told them only to be in position, and to wait for his signal, and to make sure the exit from Calder's was properly covered. What he had not told them, what he had not told anyone, was the thing he had decided in the 30 seconds of silence after Sienna Marlowe had said, "I want to meet." He had decided that the preliminary files were not enough. He had decided that the woman herself was the leverage he needed now. Not information from her, not a betrayal she provided willingly. Her physical presence, in his possession, in a room that Dante Valeri could not reach, was worth more than any ledger, because it would produce from Dante Valeri exactly the kind of reaction that no strategic intelligence, no federal contact, no 4 years of careful documentation could survive. The offer had been real, in its way. The exit he'd described was real. But the real plan, the plan he'd been carrying since he'd looked at the photograph and seen the fracture in Dante's face, was simpler and older and far more reliable than anything built on trust. The plan was to take her. And Sienna Marlowe, who was very good at reading rooms and very good at reading people, and had spent 9 months reading Dante Valeri more accurately than anyone else in his life, was walking into Calder's restaurant at 10 o'clock tonight without fully understanding that the 12-hour clock had never been about the ledger. It had always been about her. The restaurant called Calder's had 34 tables and a bar that ran the length of the eastern wall and a kitchen that closed at 9. Sienna knew this because she had spent the 4 hours between the phone call and her departure memorizing the floor plan, the exit points, the sightlines from the street, and the specific location of every camera visible in the publicly available street imagery of the block. She walked in at 9:58. 2 minutes early, because arriving exactly on time, read is rehearsed, and arriving late, read is reluctant. And she needed Marek to read her as someone who had made a decision and was moving forward with it at a pace that was her own. The restaurant was mostly empty, a couple near the window finishing dessert. A man alone at the bar with a glass of something amber. A waiter moving with the unhurried economy of someone counting the minutes to closing. Marek was at a table near the back. He was alone, which she noted and did not believe. He was wearing a dark jacket and had the quality of stillness she'd come to associate, through Carlo's information and her own research, with men who were very comfortable in rooms where they held the structural advantage. He stood when she approached, which was a performance of courtesy so controlled it was almost its own kind of threat. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "you look like someone who's made a decision." "I look like someone who's tired," she said, and sat down. He sat across from her. He had a glass of water in front of him, untouched. She registered the waiter's position, the door to the kitchen, the emergency exit partially visible at the edge of her sightline. She registered the man at the bar, who had not looked up when she came in, which meant he was either genuinely indifferent or very good at not looking up. She was betting on the second one. "The files," Marek said. He did not bother with preamble, which she respected even as she catalogued it. "Where?" "Documentation first," she said. "You told me the exit was real. Show me what real looks like." He looked at her for a moment. The performance of pleasantness was thinner at this hour, in this light, with this much of the evening's weight behind it. What was underneath it was not cruel precisely, but it was the quality that preceded cruelty when circumstances requested it. She had met men like this before. She knew what the face meant. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. He set it on the table and slid it toward her without opening it. She opened it. Inside were 3 documents: a travel authorization, a bank routing confirmation with a number and an amount that was real enough to have weight, the kind of number that meant someone had done research into what it would take to make a person's old life functionally unreachable, a letter with a name she recognized, a federal official in another district outside New York, the kind of name that meant Marek had reach she hadn't fully accounted for. She took her time with each one. She needed him to see her taking her time, processing the reality of it. A woman arriving at the conclusion that the offer was genuine. She also needed the actual time, because the documents were real and she was actually reading them, and there were details in them that were going to matter to the conversation happening simultaneously in the parking structure 2 blocks east. "The main ledger," she said. She looked up from the documents. "Not the convoy files. You know those aren't complete." Something moved in his face. Confirmation, quickly contained. "I know they're not what I need." "The main ledger is at a storage facility in Red Hook," she said. "Building 4, Unit 37. The access code changes every 72 hours. The current code is 91478. She watched him. He was very still. "That's specific," he said. "I work for a specific man," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the quality of attention that was also an assessment, running her against his existing intelligence, checking the information for structural consistency, looking for the seam where a lie shows its edge. She held his gaze and kept her breathing even and let him look. The access code was real. The storage facility was real. Unit 37 existed and was registered to a Valeri shell company and would appear, to anyone who checked in the next 2 hours, to be an active storage location for documents of significance. It would appear this way because Roman had spent the previous 3 hours making it appear this way, with the specific attention to structural detail that made the Valeri organization dangerous in ways that went beyond physical force. What was in Unit 37 was not the ledger. "Red Hook," Marek said. "Red Hook," she confirmed. He reached for his phone. He held it without looking at it, the gesture of a man communicating something to someone without appearing to communicate it. She tracked the gesture in her peripheral vision without letting her eyes move. The man at the bar shifted slightly on his stool. There it was. "I'll have someone verify," Marek said. "Of course you will," she said. He looked at her. The performance of pleasantness was gone now, not replaced by hostility, but by something more neutral, and in some ways more frightening, the expression of a man who is no longer managing an impression because he no longer needs to. "You understand that if the information is wrong, the exit I described becomes something different." "I understand," she said. "You understand specifically what different means." "Mr. Vasco," she said, "I've spent 9 months inside the Valeri organization. I'm not unfamiliar with what different means." He nodded. Once, slowly, in the way that meant he found that answer satisfactory. Then he said, "I'm going to need you to stay here while we verify." She looked at him. "An hour," he said. "Perhaps less. You'll be comfortable." He gestured slightly toward the kitchen door. "There's a room in the back that's more private than this." There it was, not asked, not framed as a request, simply stated, in the specific register of something that was already decided and was being communicated rather than proposed. She looked at the kitchen door. She looked at Marek. She looked at the envelope on the table between them. She had 45 seconds, approximately, before the decision calcified. She knew this because she knew how these moments moved. She had read enough of them in 9 months of sitting in rooms where decisions were made by men who understood force as an organizing principle. 45 seconds before Marek's very still quality became something operational. She needed to hold the performance for 45 seconds. She reached for the envelope. "Leave it," Marek said. She left it. She stood. She was aware of every point of her body in space. The table edge. The distance to the kitchen door. The distance to the front entrance. The man at the bar in her peripheral vision who was no longer pretending to drink. She was aware of the specific weight of what was about to happen. The specific quality of a plan arriving at the moment where plans either hold or don't. And she was aware, underneath all of that, of the fact that her heart was beating hard enough to feel it in her throat. She did not show any of this. She moved toward the kitchen door because she had calculated that moving without resistance gave her 30 additional seconds before Mark's posture shifted from managing to containing, and 30 seconds was what she needed. She pushed through the kitchen door. The kitchen was empty of staff, which meant it had been cleared, which meant Marek had arranged this in advance, which meant the conversation at the table had been performance on both sides from the moment she walked in. She was through the kitchen in 4 steps, and her hand was on the emergency exit bar when the man from the bar came through the door behind her. She hit the exit bar. The alarm didn't sound. That was wrong. Emergency exits triggered alarms. The absence of an alarm meant it had been disabled, which meant they had been here before her, which meant the exit was not an exit. She went through it anyway because the alternative was staying in the kitchen. The alley behind Calder's was narrow and dark and cold in the way that December alleys are cold, the cold that lives in brick and doesn't release. She had 3 feet of visibility in each direction before the alley turned. She turned left because left was toward the street, and the street was where the rest of the plan existed. She made it approximately 15 feet. The man who came around the corner from the left was not someone she recognized, which meant he was not someone from Carlo's information or the surveillance files or anything she'd been working from. He was large and efficient, and he moved like someone who did this professionally and had not found it difficult in some time. She had been in physical confrontations before. Not many, and not recently. She knew, in the abstract, that she was not going to win a physical confrontation with someone who looked like this. She had approximately 2 seconds to make a decision that was not about winning. She turned back toward the exit door, which was still open, and she screamed, not from fear precisely, but with intention, as loudly and as specifically as she could, the word that she and Roman had agreed would mean, the plan has failed, we are at the exit, come now. The word was Dante's name. She screamed at once, full volume, into the cold alley air, and then the man from the corner had her arm and was moving her back toward the exit door with the professional efficiency of someone who had been told if she makes noise, contain her quickly, and she went with the momentum of it because fighting it used energy she needed for what came after. What came after happened in the next 90 seconds, and it happened like this. The sound of something moving fast at the far end of the alley. Not one set of footsteps. 3. The man containing her turned toward the sound. His grip shifted, compensating for the new direction of threat, and in the half-second of that shift, she got her left arm free, and she used it to put her elbow into the side of his face with everything she had behind it, which was not as much as she would have liked, but was enough to make him stagger 1 step. And that 1 step was enough. Roman came around the corner first. She registered this with the part of her brain that was tracking everything simultaneously and filing it. Roman, who moved in a way that was very different from the warm, careful man she knew from coffee shops and office corridors. Roman, who had been with the Valeri organization for 26 years and had not survived that by being only charming. Behind Roman, 2 men she recognized as Valeri security. Behind them, Dante. She had known he would be there. Roman had told her. But knowing it and seeing it were different things, and what she saw in the 4 seconds between when he came around the corner and when the alley became too chaotic to track individual expressions was the specific quality of a man who has held himself in reserve for as long as he could physically manage it, and has now arrived at the place where holding is no longer possible. It was not the jealousy from the ballroom. That had been the face of a man feeling something he hadn't expected. This was something older and more essential. The face of someone for whom everything abstract has just become concrete. The alley erupted. It was not a long fight. Long fights in alleys at 10 o'clock at night were the province of films. Real ones were fast and loud and ended with someone making a decision about what the situation was worth to them. Marek's man from the bar came through the exit door. Roman's people managed the geometry of the alley with the specific professionalism of people who had assessed it in advance, which they had, because the plan had always included the possibility that the kitchen exit would be the actual exit point rather than the front door. Sienna pressed herself against the alley wall and stayed there, out of the geometric center of what was happening, because she was not useful in the physical middle of it, and getting in the way of people who were useful would make her a liability. She was breathing hard. Her arm where the man had gripped it was going to bruise. She was tracking the sound and movement of the alley with the attention she'd been developing for 9 months in rooms where things happened fast. Dante reached her in approximately 40 seconds. He put himself between her and the remaining movement in the alley, not touching her, not grabbing her, just physically positioning himself as a structure between her and the remaining threat. And she understood that this was what he was. Not a romantic gesture, but an instinct, the specific instinct of someone for whom protecting a particular thing has become the organizing principle of whatever they're doing. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was controlled, but barely. She could hear what was beneath the control in the way you hear the river under ice. "My arm," she said. "It's not serious." He looked at her arm. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled anger from the office. Not the strategic fury she'd seen when he said Carlo's name. Something more primary than either of those. The meet was a trap, she said, because she needed to say it clearly and quickly, and before anything else took the conversation in a direction that didn't move the plan forward. He was never going to let me walk out with the documents. He wanted me in the room. She paused. He wanted me as the leverage, not the information. "I know," Dante said. She looked at him. "We intercepted a communication 2 hours ago," he said, "after you left. Marek told his people the ledger was secondary. He told them—" He stopped. Something worked in his face. "He told them to bring you to the maritime terminal in Red Hook." "He's already there," Roman said from somewhere behind her. She turned. Roman was standing at the mouth of the alley, on his phone, his expression doing the very specific thing it did when the intelligence picture was shifting faster than the plan. "He sent people to the storage unit when?" she asked. 20 minutes ago, Roman said. "They're at the unit now. They'll find it in about 10 minutes. She did the math. "He'll know it's empty in 10 minutes. He'll know we fed him the location, which means he knows—" "That you didn't come to him," Dante finished. "That the meeting was us operating against him, not you operating against us." The alley was quiet now. The two men who had been Marek's were no longer a factor, handled with the professional efficiency she'd tried not to watch directly. The cold pressed in. Somewhere distant, the sound of the city, indifferent. "He'll move on the real ledger," she said. "He doesn't know where the real ledger is," Roman said. "Carlo didn't know. We're confident." "He doesn't need the ledger," she said. Her brain was moving very fast now, faster than she was comfortable with, the way it moved when everything was rearranging at speed, and she needed to keep pace with the rearrangement. If he can't have the ledger, he moves to denial. He exposes Reyes. He goes to the officials named in it, and he tells them the evidence exists and that the case is almost complete, and they spend Marek's money and their own influence destroying the case before it's ready. She paused. "He doesn't need to win. He just needs to prevent us from winning. That's a different problem." The silence in the alley had the quality of something shifting weight. Dante was looking at her. She could feel it even when she wasn't looking directly at him. The specific quality of his attention in this mode. The mode that was not professional and not managed, and not the careful distance of 9 months of excellent boundaries. "The maritime terminal," she said. "You said that's where he wanted to take me." "Red Hook Terminal," Roman confirmed. "The abandoned one off the southern end of the port." She thought. She thought with the specific intensity of someone who has arrived at the moment where the plan that exists is no longer sufficient and the new plan has to be built in real time from available materials. "He's there now," she said. "Or going there. He thinks the meat produced what he wanted. He doesn't know yet that the storage unit is empty, which means for approximately the next 9 minutes. He thinks he has me, and he thinks he has the ledger location, and he thinks the play worked." 9 minutes, Dante said. "Less," she said. "His people at the unit are fast." Roman was already on the phone. Dante was looking at her with the controlled ferocity of a man who has spent the last 4 hours standing in a cold parking structure being exactly where he said he would be, and is now standing in a cold alley with a plan that has partially failed, and a woman with a bruised arm, and approximately 8 minutes before the next phase became irreversible. "You want to go to the terminal," he said. "I want to go to the terminal," she said. Because it's where he is. Because the thing Marek built this entire evening to produce was a position of strength. Me in his possession, the ledger in his possession, Dante Valeri making reactive decisions from a position of fear. None of those things happened, which means he's at the terminal with his people and his plan, and no result. She met Dante's eyes. A man like Marek, in that position, does not go home and reassess. He escalates, and we know where he is. And the federal contacts, Dante said. If he starts moving on Reyes tonight, he won't move on Reyes tonight if he's at the terminal waiting to find out what went wrong, she said. We have a window, narrow, but it exists. Roman closed his phone. He looked at Dante. I can have 6 people at the terminal in 20 minutes. Dante was still looking at her. The ferocity had not gone anywhere. Underneath it was the thing she'd learned to read. Not the jealousy, which had been the beginning of all of this, but what was underneath the jealousy, the thing the jealousy had been pointing toward, and that he'd been refusing to look at directly for 9 months. This ends tonight, he said. Not a question. It ends tonight, she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned to Roman. Get the cars. Roman moved. Dante reached out and did something she hadn't anticipated. He put his hand briefly, very briefly, on the side of her face, the way you touch something you've been frightened for and are relieved to find intact. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then his hand was gone, and he was moving and she was moving with him, out of the alley and into the street and into the cold night air of a city that was still doing its indifferent thing, burning its lights and moving its people, and not knowing or caring that somewhere in the southern end of its port, a man who had been waiting 3 years for this advantage was about to discover that the advantage he thought he had was the last mistake he would make. The cars were there in 4 minutes. She got into the second one. Dante was in the first. Roman was on his phone in the front seat, coordinating the people who were already moving toward the terminal from 3 different directions, managing the geometry of an operation that had not been planned as an assault and was now becoming one. She sat in the back seat of the car and looked at her hands in her lap, both of them steady, and she thought about the ledger and Tanner and the Tuesday morning in November 6 years ago, and the photograph face down in a desk drawer, and a midnight blue dress that arrived without a name on the card. She thought about what Roman had said. The reason Dante is terrified is that you are the first person in 6 years who walked into something he couldn't protect her from and said, "Let me handle it." She thought about what she'd said to Dante on the terrace, the thing she was only now fully understanding. Love without trust is only another form of control. She had said it to him. She had meant it for him. She was only now understanding that it was also for her. That she had trusted him tonight. Trusted him to be in the parking structure when she said she needed him there. Trusted him to hold for the 24 hours when everything in him wanted to move. Trusted him to be in that alley when she screamed his name into the cold air. He had been there. The car was moving fast through the streets of Lower Manhattan, heading south toward the harbor, toward the terminal, toward Marek Vasco, who was standing in an empty building with a plan that had come apart and a phone that was about to ring with news that would make him understand, for the first time, that the woman in the photograph was not the variable he thought she was. 8 minutes to the terminal. In the first car, Dante was looking out the window at the city moving past. She couldn't see him, but she knew this as certainly as she knew the floor plan of Calder's restaurant, because she had spent 9 months learning the shape of this man's silences. Roman's voice came through the earpiece she'd been given before she left the office. Terminal has 2 entry points, North Dock Gate and the Eastern Service entrance. Marek's people are confirmed inside. We count 6, possibly 8. His inner circle, she said. Most of them, Roman said. Which is interesting. It was interesting. Marek had not sent mid-level people to the terminal. He had come himself with the people he trusted most, which meant he had considered this the final act of something rather than a tactical position. He had come to the terminal expecting to receive the confirmation of a victory. He had come to the terminal expecting her. Roman, she said. Yeah. The recordings, she said. Carlo gave us the communication logs from the past 14 months. Everything Marek said to him, everything he authorized, the payments to the officials, the authorization for the Barker Street ambush. She paused. Are they clean? Legally admissible? A pause on Roman's end. Reyes said 3 months ago they were, with the ledger as corroboration. Without the ledger? A longer pause. I don't know. Find out, she said. Before we get to the terminal. She ended the call. She looked at her hands again. The plan that had been built around the ledger as the delivery mechanism was still the right plan. The ledger, ready in 6 weeks, with Reyes's case complete, was still the right outcome. But she had understood something in the alley that she hadn't fully understood before. Marek's escalation had changed the timeline. and waiting 6 weeks for the ledger to be ready was no longer an option available to them, because Marek would spend those 6 weeks dismantling the case from the outside, approaching the officials, burning what he could burn, which meant they needed something that didn't require 6 more weeks, which meant the recordings from Carlo's 14 months of access, if they were admissible without the ledger, were not just corroboration, they were the weapon. The car turned south. The harbor appeared ahead, the black water and the lights of the port, the massive indifferent infrastructure of cargo and commerce that Dante Valeri had spent 20 years building his life around and that Marek Vasco had spent 3 years trying to take. The maritime terminal appeared, dark, the lights off, the kind of building that looks abandoned because it is mostly abandoned, and also because the people inside it have chosen not to advertise their presence. The car stopped. She got out into the cold air. Dante was already out of the first car, already looking at the terminal, already running the same calculations she was running. Roman was beside him with his phone and his expression doing the thing it did when the situation had weight. She walked to where Dante was standing. He looked at her. One look, fast, assessing, her arm, her face, the quality of her attention. Then back to the terminal. "The recordings," she said, "without the ledger. Tell me if they're enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Tanner," she said, "the Tuesday in November. Is it in the recordings?" The cold held the space between them. "It's in the recordings," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Carlo was with Marek when it was authorized. I didn't know that until 3 months ago." She absorbed that. The specific weight of it, 3 months of carrying the knowledge that the recording existed, that the authorization for his wife's death was somewhere in a communication log, that the thing he'd spent 6 years building the ledger toward was already, in part, available. "Why didn't you move on it?" she asked. "Because Tanner would have walked," he said. The recording was partial. Marek's voice, Carlo confirming, but Tanner only referred to by a position title, not by name. Without the ledger connecting the position title to the specific individual, he stopped. "He would have walked." "Would," she said. Past tense. He looked at her. "In 14 months of access," she said, "Carlo was in a lot of rooms. If Tanner was discussed with Marek more than once, if his name appears anywhere else in the 14 months of recordings." She watched it land in Dante's face. The specific moment when a calculation that has been running one direction for 6 years turns. "Roman," Dante said. Roman was already calling. Inside the terminal, a phone rang. Marek's. She could not hear it from outside, but she knew it was ringing. The call from his people at the storage unit in Red Hook. The call that would arrive in the next 90 seconds. The call that would tell him the unit was empty, and the woman had not delivered what she appeared to deliver, and the evening had not gone the way the evening was supposed to go. 90 seconds. Roman was talking rapidly into his phone, his voice low and fast, the voice he used when he needed an answer before the situation moved past the point where the answer was useful. Dante was standing very still beside her. She could feel the heat of him in the cold air, the specific presence of someone who had managed to be exactly where they said they would be every time it mattered tonight, and was now waiting in the cold outside a dark building for a calculation to complete that would tell him whether 6 years of patient, costly, careful work could end tonight or whether he had to hold for 6 more weeks, while the man inside that building tried to dismantle it. Roman's phone call ended. The silence lasted 2 seconds. 3 mentions of Tanner by name, Roman said, including one with Marek explicitly authorizing what he called the November solution, and Tanner confirmed by name as the one who cleared the route. The cold air. The water, somewhere beyond the terminal. The dark building with its dark windows, and the men inside it who had come expecting a victory. Dante turned to look at her, and in his face, in the margins of it, in the spaces where the controlled surface had worn thin with the weight of the night, was something she had seen once before, on a terrace in December, under chandeliers, in a midnight blue dress that had arrived without a name. Not the jealousy, not the fear, not the strategic intelligence, or the 20 years of careful management. Just the look of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and can feel, for the first time, the specific quality of what it would mean to set it down. "We go in," he said. "We go in," she said. Roman was already moving toward the north dock gate, and the Valeri people were fanning out toward the eastern entrance. and the terminal was about to have a very specific and irreversible kind of conversation. And inside it, Marek Vasco's phone was ringing with news that had arrived approximately 30 seconds too late to do him any good. She walked toward the terminal beside Dante Valeri. Not behind him, not ahead of him, but beside him, which was where she had been for 9 months without either of them being willing to say so. And the cold air moved around them both, and the lights of the harbor threw their reflection on the water, and the night was about to crack open into something that could not be walked back from by anyone in it. The North Dock gate gave way on the second attempt. Roman went through first with 2 men behind him, and Sienna heard the gate's metal protest against the cold air, a sound like something being forced that did not want to be forced. And then the interior of the terminal swallowed them, and the acoustics changed entirely. The terminal was vast in the specific way that industrial spaces become vast when they are stripped of their purpose. High ceilings, the smell of salt and old machinery, the sound of the harbor moving somewhere beyond the walls, patient and indifferent. Dante moved in directly behind Roman. Sienna was beside him. She had been told, in the planning conversation at the office, that she would remain at the perimeter. She had said yes to that in the way she sometimes said yes to things she had not fully agreed to, the yes that meant, I understand what you're asking, rather than I will do what you're asking. Dante had looked at her when she said it with the expression of a man who recognized the distinction and did not have time to argue about it. He had not argued about it. She was inside the terminal. The space resolved itself as her eyes adjusted. The terminal had been a functioning cargo processing facility until 4 years ago, when a dispute over Port Authority contracts had shuttered it pending resolution. The resolution had never come, in the particular way that certain disputes become permanent when the people managing them find the dispute more useful than the resolution. Marek had money in the Port Authority. The terminal's vacancy was partially his design, crates, most of them empty. A long elevated walkway running the length of the eastern wall. Lights at the far end, 2 of them, industrial work lights throwing cold white illumination over a cleared space near the loading dock where 4 men were standing and 1 man was sitting on a crate with his phone in his hand and the expression of someone who has just received news that has reorganized everything he thought he knew about the last 6 hours. Marek looked up when they came in. He had the quality of stillness she'd noted at the restaurant, but it was different now. The stillness of calculation rather than comfort. The stillness of a man who is running numbers very fast and finding that none of them produced the result he expected. His 4 men registered the entry points simultaneously, the trained response of people who had been placed in this room for exactly this kind of contingency. The geometry of the terminal settled into its positions. Roman's people at the north gate. 2 more coming through the eastern service entrance, visible through the gaps in the crates. The elevated walkway. And Sienna noticed, without showing that she noticed, that there was a 5th man up there, in the shadow of the walkway's corner, who had not been in the original count of Marek's people. She put her hand briefly on Dante's arm, pressed twice. He did not look at her. His hand moved in the specific way that passed the signal to Roman without a word. Roman had already seen it. Marek stood up from the crate. He put his phone in his pocket with a deliberateness that was its own kind of communication. I'm done with what the phone was telling me. I'm here now, in this room, with you. He looked at Dante with the expression of a man confronting an equation that has resolved differently than predicted, but who has not yet decided what the new solution means. Dante, he said. The way he said it was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge weather. Marek, Dante said. Same register. 20 years of conflict compressed into 2 syllables. She didn't come alone, Marek said. She rarely does things the way people expect, Dante said. Marek's eyes moved to her. The assessment she'd felt at the restaurant was sharper now, recalibrated by the evening's events. She could feel him revising his model of her, not the version that was a soft point, not the version that was turnable, but a third version he hadn't fully accounted for. The storage unit was empty, he said to her. Yes, she said. The ledger was never in Red Hook. No. He nodded slowly. Something in his face did the specific thing that faces do when a person confirms what they already know and the confirmation costs them something anyway. And Carlo told you everything he knew, she said, which was not everything there was. Marek looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Dante. You let her run this. I let her do her job, Dante said. Her job, Marek said, with a quality that was not quite contempt and not quite admiration. Is that what we're calling it? Call it whatever you want, Dante said. The result is the same. The terminal held the silence for a moment. The harbor moved beyond the walls. The fifth man on the walkway had not moved, but Roman's people had adjusted their positions in the way that good people adjust positions, slightly, without announcement, so that the geometry of the room was no longer what Marek's count had assumed. The recordings, Marek said. He said it flatly, without inflection, which told her that he had known about the recordings for some time and had calculated that they were insufficient without the ledger and had made his decisions accordingly. He was now revising that calculation in real time. 14 months, she said. Carlo was thorough. You told him to be. Marek looked at her. 3 mentions of Tanner by name. 3 mentions of Tanner by name, she confirmed, including the November authorization. The change in Marek's face was small and real, and she tracked it precisely. Not fear. Marek was past the age and experience level where fear showed cleanly. Something more functional. The recognition of a structural problem that cannot be solved by the tools currently available. The recordings are partial, he said, without the ledger. We have the ledger, Dante said. The terminal went very quiet. Sienna did not look at Dante. She kept her eyes on Marek, on his face, on the specific moment where the calculation completed and arrived at its answer. You don't, Marek said. Not as a denial, as a test. We've had it for 4 years, Dante said. The question was never whether we had it. The question was what it took to make it usable. He paused. We needed 6 more weeks. You moved before we had 6 more weeks. Another pause. You gave us 3 days instead. She understood, in this moment, what Dante had done. What he had been doing since she'd come to him with the timeline revision, with the knowledge that Carlo had known more than they'd thought, with the 12-hour clock and the offer from Marek's call. He had not been running the same plan she was running. He had been running a parallel one, and the point where they converged was here, in this terminal, with Marek Vasco understanding for the first time that the advantage he'd spent 3 years building had been used against him. The ledger had been moved. Not to Red Hook. That had been her layer of the plan, the false location, the performance at Calder's. Dante's layer had been different. In the 72 hours since Marek's people had attacked the Barker Street convoy, the ledger had been transmitted, digitally, encrypted, in pieces that required specific keys to reassemble, to Thomas Reyes. Not the complete case, not the 6 weeks ready version, the version that existed now, in its current state, with its gaps and its partial documentation and its 3 recordings that mentioned Tanner by name, including the November authorization. Not perfect. Not everything Dante had wanted it to be. Enough. Reyes has it, Dante said, as of 4 hours ago. Whatever you do in this terminal tonight, whatever you do to me or anyone here, the material is already in federal hands. The case is already open. He looked at Marek with the specific quality of a man who has paid a very high price for something and intends to make sure the cost is understood. The version you buried for 6 years. The question of who cleared the route. Marek's 4 men had not moved. They were professionals, and they were waiting for a signal, the specific signal that meant the conversation was over and the other part began. Marek had not given it. He would not give it now, and she could see him understanding that he would not give it, understanding the geometry of the room, the positions, the 5th man on the walkway who Roman's people had quietly managed in the past 3 minutes. The fact that Marek Vasco had spent 20 years being the most dangerous presence in any room he occupied and was standing in a room where that was no longer true. Tanner will have lawyers before morning, Marek said. Tanner will have lawyers before morning, Dante agreed. And a federal case that includes his voice on a recording authorizing an action that killed a private citizen who was not involved in anything. His voice was very controlled. She could hear what the control was containing. His lawyers will do what lawyers do. It will take time, but it will happen. And me, Marek said. Dante looked at him. You came here with 6 men, Marek said. This isn't a federal operation. This is personal. He met Dante's eyes. So what happens to me, Dante? In this terminal, tonight? The question sat in the cold air. She watched Dante's face. She watched the 6 years of a Tuesday morning in November move through the controlled surface, not erasing it, not breaking it, but present, real. The cost of the thing he'd been carrying and was now standing at the specific destination of. Nothing, Dante said. Marek was very still. Nothing happens to you tonight, Dante said. You walk out of this terminal. Your people walk out. He paused. And you spend the next several months watching what you built come apart through a federal process that you cannot intimidate, cannot buy, and cannot disappear. Because the people you could have bought are named in the material that's already in Reyes's hands, and they are going to be too busy protecting themselves to protect you. Mark looked at him for a long, long moment. She could see him testing the offer for the trap inside it, the way you test ice for the crack. He found the thing he was looking for, and his face did something she hadn't expected. It settled. The tension that had been running through him since they'd come through the gate released in a specific way. Not relief, but recognition. The look of a man who has been in a particular kind of conflict for a long time and can feel it ending, even when the ending is not the one he wanted. You could have ended this differently, Marek said. Quiet. Observational. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, you had the means. I know, Dante said. Why didn't you? Dante said nothing for a moment. She watched him hold the question, and she thought she knew what the answer was, and she thought he might not say it, and then he said it. Because ending it differently would have made me you, he said. And I've been trying for a long time to be something different, even when it cost more. Marek looked at him. Something crossed his face that she could not fully identify. It was too old and too private to read from the outside. Then he looked at her, briefly, with the expression of someone completing an assessment. He sent you a dress, Marek said. She blinked. Carlo told me, Marek said, 3 weeks ago. Said Dante picked it himself. Spent 20 minutes with the catalog. He almost smiled. The almost smile of someone acknowledging something true about the human condition in the specific context of having lost because of it. I thought it was the weakness, the dress, the photograph. He paused. I was wrong about what it was. He picked up his coat from the crate. He nodded to his men, the signal she'd been watching for, and it was not the signal she'd been braced for, but a different one, the signal that meant we're leaving. He walked toward the north gate without hurrying, without looking back, with the specific dignity of a man who has lost and knows it and has decided that the losing will be done cleanly. His 4 men followed. The terminal listened to their footsteps until the footsteps were gone. Then it was quiet. Roman let out a breath that she suspected he'd been holding for some time. He said something into his phone quietly, and she heard from the response that the perimeter people were standing down. The 5th man on the walkway turned out to be one of their own, placed before they'd entered. She looked up and saw him and looked back down. Dante had not moved. She walked to where he was standing, not beside him this time, in front of him, because this was not the moment for beside. She stood in front of him and looked at his face, and what was in it was the specific exhaustion of something that has been carried for a very long time and has just been partially, irreversibly set down. Not relieved, not victorious, just lighter, in the way that things become lighter when some of their weight is finally in the past tense. It won't be clean, she said. The case, Tanner and his lawyers, it's going to be a long process. I know, he said, and Marek walks around free for however long the federal process takes. I know that too. Is that... She stopped, started again. Are you okay with that? He looked at her. The exhaustion in his face had something underneath it that was not peace. She wasn't naive enough to call it peace, but was the specific quality of a person who has made a decision that aligns with who they're trying to be, even when it costs them something, and is living in the immediate aftermath of that decision. Ask me in a month, he said. Fair, she said. Roman appeared at her peripheral vision, coat on, phone in hand, the efficient presentation of a man who has managed a very complicated evening and is now managing its aftermath. He looked at Dante. He looked at her. He looked at the space between them with the expression of someone who has known Dante Valeri for 26 years and is recalibrating something significant. Cars are outside, Roman said. Give us a minute, Dante said. Roman gave them a minute. He walked toward the north gate with his characteristic ease, and they were alone in the terminal with the harbor sounds and the cold and the industrial lights throwing their shadows long across the concrete floor. Dante looked at her arm. The bruising had developed while they'd been inside, visible now above her wrist, purpling in the cold. He looked at it the way he'd looked at it in the alley, briefly, assessment first, and then with the thing underneath the assessment that was not professional. "I'm going to need a better system," he said, "for situations where the plan changes and you're the one inside it." "The plan changed because Marek was better prepared than we calculated," she said. "That's a Marek problem, not a system problem." "I'd like it to be both," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the bruise. She said, "Dante." He looked up. "I screamed your name," she said, "in the alley." He said nothing. "Not because I needed to be rescued," she said. "That was the signal we agreed on. But I want you to know that it wasn't only operational. The word." She stopped, started again. "I knew you were there. I knew you'd stayed when I told you to hold. And when the exit didn't work and the alarm didn't sound, and I needed to know that something in this evening was still on the right side of working," she stopped again. "Your name was the thing I said." The terminal was quiet around them. Dante looked at her for a long moment. The specific quality of a man who has been offered something real and is being careful with it, careful in the way that people are careful with things they have learned, at considerable cost, to take seriously. He said, "I was counting the seconds from when you went into Calder's." "I know," she said. "I got to 90 and I stopped counting because it wasn't helping." "I know." "Roman told me to stay at the perimeter." He paused. "I heard you scream and I was already moving before he finished the sentence." She nodded. She understood this. She understood it in the specific way that you understand things that confirm what you had already measured but not named. "We're going to have to figure out what this is," she said. "What we are. With clear eyes, not in the middle of a gala or a terminal or a December alley." "Yes," he said. "That's going to require honesty from both of us about things that are complicated." "Yes," he said again. "And the organization, my role in it. That needs to be on my terms, not reorganized around Sienna." He said her name the way he'd said it on the terrace, like a question that was also an answer. "I know." She looked at him. "I spent 9 months being very careful," he said. "I know what careful costs, and what it produces, and what it fails to protect. I'm not interested in careful anymore." He paused. "I am interested in honest and difficult. And whatever this is, worked out between two people who are both better at their jobs than they are at this particular thing." He held her gaze. "If that's available." "It's available," she said. He nodded. "Once." She said, "You picked midnight blue." He said, "You wore it." She almost smiled. "I didn't have anything better." "You did," he said. "I'd seen your closet. You had the green dress from the Shanghai meeting. You wore the blue one anyway." She had worn the blue one anyway. She had known, in the way she knew things she didn't announce, that she was going to wear it from the moment it arrived. She had spent 3 days telling herself it was because she didn't have something better, and she had known the whole time that wasn't the reason. "We should go," she said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. The terminal settled around them. The harbor moved. The industrial lights hummed. Somewhere in the city, a federal official named Thomas Reyes was looking at material that had been building for 4 years and beginning to understand the shape of a case that was going to take longer than 6 weeks, but would eventually produce specific and irreversible consequences for specific men who had believed themselves to be in positions of permanent safety. Somewhere, Marek Vasco was in a car heading north, and the particular silence in that car was the silence of a man calculating what could still be salvaged, which was a smaller number than he'd believed at the beginning of the evening. Somewhere in a drawer in an office in a midtown building, a photograph lay face down. Dante moved first. He turned toward the north gate, and she moved beside him, not behind him, not ahead, beside, and they walked out of the terminal together into the cold harbor air, which hit them both with the full force of a December night that had not paused for anything that had happened inside the building. Roman was leaning against the first car with the patience of a man who had spent 26 years waiting for Dante Valeri to make complicated decisions. He looked at them when they came out. Something in his face did the thing it did when he was reassessing something significant. He opened the car door without comment. She got in. Dante got in beside her. Roman took the front seat. The car pulled away from the terminal and into the street, heading north through the harbor district, the water falling behind them and the city rising ahead. Nobody spoke for several minutes. The silence had the quality of something that didn't need to be filled, the specific silence of people who have been through something together and are letting it settle before they decide what it means. Roman broke it. "Reyes called while you were inside," he said. "He's seen the transmission. He says the November recording, the one with Tanner by name, is the best piece of evidence he's had in 2 years. The rest is strong. He needs to talk to Dante in the morning." He paused. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell him it's not everything, but it's enough to open the door and I know how to walk through doors." Dante said, "Tell him 7 a.m. "Already did," Roman said. "He said he'll be there." The car moved north. The city opened around them as they moved into the commercial districts. The streets fuller now, with the particular late-night life of a city that doesn't stop, that has never stopped, that will be going in exactly this way long after all of them have resolved their particular dramas and their particular costs and have become whatever they are going to become. She looked out the window. She thought about what Marek had said in the terminal. I thought it was the weakness, the dress, the photograph, the almost smile. I was wrong about what it was. She thought about what he'd been wrong about and what he'd been right about and the specific distinction. He'd been right that the photograph showed something real, the fracture in Dante's controlled surface, the feeling that had been building for 9 months and had finally, on a terrace in December, cost more than Dante's discipline could contain. Marek had been right that it was real. He'd been wrong about what real meant. He'd built his entire operation on the assumption that what Dante felt for her was the same thing Dante had felt for Elena. The vulnerability of attachment, the soft point that enemies exploit, the structural weakness that love produces in powerful men who haven't learned to account for it. He hadn't understood that Dante had spent 6 years after Elena learning exactly that lesson, and that what Dante had slowly, reluctantly, expensively learned was not how to stop having soft points, but how to stop treating the people he trusted as things he needed to protect rather than people he needed to trust. The difference was the whole territory. The car stopped outside her building. Roman didn't say anything, which she appreciated. Dante got out when she did. She hadn't expected that. They stood on the sidewalk. The city moved around them without noticing them, which was one of New York's most useful qualities. Its absolute indifference to whatever you were carrying. 7 a.m., she said. "Reyes." 7 a.m., he confirmed. "I'll be there." He looked at her. "You don't have to be there for that meeting. It's the organizational side of—" "I'll be there," she said again, evenly. Not as an argument, as a statement of what was going to happen. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay." She looked at him standing on the sidewalk in the cold, coat open, the harbor night still in his hair, the exhaustion visible now in ways it hadn't been when there was still work to do. She looked at the face she had spent 9 months learning to read, the controlled surface and the things that moved beneath it, the fractures and the extraordinary discipline required to maintain the surface anyway, the 20 years of something enormous and the 6 years of something devastating and the 9 months of careful and the one night of the terrace and the midnight blue dress and the alley and the terminal and everything that was now behind them and everything that was now ahead. She stepped forward and put both her arms around him, just held on for a moment, not romantically, precisely, or not only romantically, but in the specific way that people hold on to things after long nights that have cost a great deal and ended in something that is not quite peace but is pointed in the right direction. He put his arms around her. He held on. Neither of them said anything. It lasted only a moment, long enough. She stepped back. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Go home," she said. "Going," he said. He didn't move immediately, then quietly. "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what specifically?" "For screaming my name," he said, "and for everything before that and after that, but specifically for that." She held his gaze for a moment. "Go home, Dante," she said. He went. She watched the car pull away. Roman lifted 2 fingers from the front seat as the car passed. Not quite a wave, not quite a salute, the Roman Calvero version of good work and good night. She found that she was genuinely glad he existed. She went inside. Her apartment was cold from the night's absence. She turned on the heat. She sat on the edge of her bed in the same position she'd sat in the previous night, the night that had been the gala, the photograph, the terrace, the dress, and she thought about the fact that 24 hours ago she had been sitting in this exact position trying to decide whether the thing she felt in Dante's presence needed a name. She thought about what Roman had said in Carmela's. People who matter to Dante Valeri have a very short shelf life. She thought about Elena's file, and the Tuesday morning, and the photograph face down in the drawer. She thought about what it had cost Dante to stand in a terminal and let Marek walk out of it. She thought about the 6 weeks the case hadn't had, and the door Reyes said he knew how to walk through. She thought about Tanner, the route cleared, the East River on a November morning. She thought about justice, which is rarely clean and rarely fast and rarely satisfying in the way you imagine it will be when you're building toward it, which arrives, when it arrives, looking less like triumph and more like a door finally being able to close. She thought about the dress, hung in her closet now, the midnight blue silk. She thought about 20 minutes with a catalog and the fact that he'd known what looked right for her and had been trying not to. She lay down. She pulled the blanket over her coat because she was too tired to take the coat off. She looked at the ceiling. What she felt was not happiness, exactly. It was something more durable than happiness. The specific feeling of having been exactly who you were in a situation that required it, of having made decisions that cost you something real, and that you would make again with full knowledge of the cost. The feeling of being, in the most essential sense, on the right side of the thing. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city moved in its permanent, unresting way. The harbor sent its cold air through the streets. Thomas Reyes was in his office reading material that had been 4 years in the building. Marek Vasco was somewhere being very quiet and very calculating about what remained available to him, which was less than he'd had at 10 o'clock that evening. Roman Calvero was probably still awake, because Roman was almost always still awake, managing the aftermath of things with the patient competence of someone who understood that the aftermath was where most of the actual work happened. And Dante Valeri was in a car heading north through the city, and she thought he was probably looking out the window the way she'd imagined him looking out the window in the part of the evening she hadn't been in the car for. And she thought he was probably thinking about 7 a.m. and about what Reyes would say, and about the specific long distance between tonight and the day, a case built on Carlo's recordings, and 4 years of careful documentation finally arrived at a result. She thought he was probably also thinking about her. She let that be true without doing anything with it. It was enough, for tonight, to let it simply be true. She slept. 3 weeks later, an indictment was unsealed in federal court naming 11 individuals, including 2 Port Authority commissioners, a state assemblyman, and a retired law enforcement official who had spent 6 years after November believing he had successfully buried the question of a cleared route and a car in the East River. His name was Tanner. He had lawyers before noon. The lawyers were very good, and the process was going to be long, and nothing about it was going to be clean or fast or satisfying in the simple way that simple stories promise. It was happening. That was enough. Dante read the indictment at his desk at 8 in the morning. He read it twice. Then he opened the top drawer and took out the photograph that had lived there face down for 6 years. The photograph of Elena, laughing at something outside the frame of the picture. Her face turned slightly away from the camera, in the way she'd always hated being photographed but had let him do it anyway. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set it face up on his desk. Not put away. Not hidden. Present. The way the past is present when you've stopped being afraid of it. As something that happened, that cost everything it cost, that shaped everything it shaped, and that does not require darkness to be real. He left it there. At 9, Sienna knocked and came in, coat still on, coffee in hand, notebook under her arm, the specific presentation of a woman who had been at a federal building since 7 a.m. and had taken notes that were going to require 2 hours of debrief to fully unpack. She sat down in her chair, across from his desk, the position she had occupied for 9 months and would continue to occupy in a role that now had a different weight and a clearer title and the same fundamental quality as before: necessary, real, earned. She looked at the photograph on the desk. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything about it. There was nothing that needed to be said. The photograph was on the desk, face up, in the light of a December morning, and Sienna Marlowe sat across from Dante Valeri with her coffee and her notebook and her 9 months of accumulated understanding of this complicated, costly, cracked-open man, and the city outside the window did its permanent, unresting thing, and the harbor sent its cold air through the streets, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do, without asking permission, without promising anything, just arriving and continuing and making room for whatever came next. She opened her notebook. Reyes needs a response to the defense team's preliminary filing by Friday, she said. What's our position? Dante said. That the recordings stand independently. The ledger corroborates but isn't required. She flipped a page. I've asked for a second opinion from Reyes's co-counsel on the admissibility question. She's good. She'll have an answer by tomorrow. Good, he said. The Harbor Authority meeting is Thursday. You need to decide before then whether you're continuing the legitimization of the shipping contracts or whether we delay pending the commission replacements. We don't delay, he said. The legitimate businesses run on their own schedule. We stop letting the other side of things set the pace. She wrote that down. Roman wants a meeting about the transition timeline. He thinks 6 months is aggressive. Roman thinks everything aggressive is aggressive, Dante said. Schedule it anyway, Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon, she wrote. She looked up. Something moved through her expression, not the professional attention, but the other thing, the thing that had been building for 9 months and had been named on a terrace in December and had survived a gala and a photograph and a 12-hour clock and an alley and a terminal and 3 weeks of federal process without losing its essential quality. How are you? He looked at her. The question she had asked in the terminal, are you okay with that? And the answer he'd given, ask me in a month. It had been 3 weeks, not a month, but she was asking. Better, he said. It was honest in the way that better is honest, not complete, not simple, but real and moving in the right direction. She nodded. She accepted that without pushing it, which was one of the many things about her that he had spent 9 months trying not to notice, and had noticed anyway. There's one more thing, she said. What? She reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope. She set it on the desk between them. He looked at it. It arrived at my apartment this morning, she said. No card. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. What's in it? He said, though something in his expression suggested he was not entirely without an idea. I haven't opened it, she said. I thought... She stopped. Started again, more simply. I thought you should be here when I did. He reached across the desk. He took the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single card, the kind that comes with flowers or formal gifts, cream-colored, heavy paper. On it, in handwriting she recognized, the same handwriting that had been on the first card, the card that had said, for the gala, were 4 words. He read them. He set the card down between them, face up, in the light. She read them. For whatever comes next. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning moved around them and the city moved outside, and the photograph of Elena sat on the desk face up in the light, and the case was opened and the harbor was there, and the next 6 months were going to be long and complicated, and nothing about any of it was going to be easy or clean or simple. None of that was the point. She picked up her coffee, she picked up her pen, she looked at her notebook, and then at the man across the desk from her. This man, specifically, with his specific costs and his specific history and his specific quality of attention when something mattered to him. And she felt, in the most honest and uncomplicated part of herself, something that was not happiness and not peace, but was bigger than both. Okay, she said, let's get to work.